Okay, now we are online.
Okay.
Здравствуйте.
Здравствуйте, здравствуйте, Жозе.
Привет, Юрий.
Привет, Юра. Да. Так, ну вот народ понемножку подтягивается. I wonder if Matt is going to join, because there is at least one question directly to him, and he might be also interested in addressing other questions.
Sorry. Hi, Emmanuel.
Shalom.
Shalom.
Celebrating this week.
Why?
No more COVID restrictions at all.
Good.
They've just decided to remove masks even indoor. So it feels really weird, but I guess smart people have decided. So.
Well, I think it all depends on the total number of people who are vaccinated. So if, according to the models, you're beyond the herd immunity.
I don't know if we are beyond the herd immunity, because still like about 30% of the population, or 35, are children, so they're still not being vaccinated. But I think there are like a sufficient percentage of the population that might get a difficult COVID is vaccinated. So I think they based the decision on that.
I see.
And we also have a new government, so...
Oh, yes. Congratulations. After 12 years with Bibi, now you have something else. Well, probably the government will fall apart in like 2-3 months. That's most likely. And then you'll have an election, which seems to be on national sport.
Yeah. We're getting pretty good at it. Or not really.
Pretty good at elections, right? Okay, well, it's kind of about time. So I cannot see Matt, but I can see at least some of the speakers. Well, most of the speakers are here. So we're going to do the following. So we received a number of questions by email, and some of them were sent to Luis, and Luis shared them with me, and others were sent to me, so I just got them. And I shared them with the speakers. Some of the questions were specifically addressed to individual speakers. Others were more open-ended, so for anybody who cares to respond. So I'm not sure, we haven't really decided how to handle everything, but one possibility is to have the first round of responses from speakers, maybe in the same or about the same order they presented during the summer school. So we are going to start with Yuri Ivanenko, and then I'm not sure if Matt Trash will join us. And if not, maybe we can, I don't know, skip and then see what happens next. And then Anatole and Ilana and Gregor and me and Mindy. And then after this first round, we'll get to open-ended questions, which are kind of for everybody. And we'll see who cares to answer them. All right, so let's try. So Yura, are you there? And the rules are the same. We keep our microphones off except for the person who speaks. And but if you want to ask your own question or comment or anything else, at any moment, just feel free to unmute and speak up. So Yura, did you get my questions?
Yes. Should you read this question or me?
Well, if you know English and you can speak, then you can do it, I guess.
I need to find
Otherwise,
it.
yeah.
I remember it, but yeah.
Oh, I can read it for you. It's from Benjamin Frigley. Researchers are now able to create personalized computational neuromuscular models of walking that closely match an individual subject's experimental EMG motion ground reaction force data. By imposing a synergy structure on the muscle activation, such model can even accurately predict how an individual subject will walk under new conditions. However, such models are controlled by an entirely feed-forward approach. And a logical next step is to use such personalized models to try to decompose the experimental EMG signals into feed-forward and feedback contributions, taking advantage of the fact that the models provide estimates of muscle length, velocity, force, tendon force, joint position, velocity, and so forth. Is it worth pursuing this neural feedback modeling goal? And if so, what is the simplest feedback model structure that should be explored first? And what specific questions should be investigated first? So
yeah. Yes, thanks, Mark. This is actually a very interesting question, very important. And I think it is a kind of potentially hot topic. And it is not so easy to answer. So, first of all, yes, it is worth pursuing. I have, though, a couple of comments about this. First of all, there are some studies, modern studies about the effect of sensory feedback on walking patterns. For example, classic study of this paper of Tag. I'm sure that Benjamin, I'm sure that you are familiar with literature actually, and but still, this paper of Tag is highly cited, and there is a sensory part of his model. But Mark, can I share the screen? I would just perhaps advise you to look at some papers that I just today refreshed my memory about the sensory that are really directly related to your question. First paper that is really directly related is the following. Just give me 5 seconds. So can you see it now? So this recent paper, it was just published 1 month ago. And those authors, I know some of them, they basically studied what you asked me, sensory modulation of gait characteristics using the model. And the effect, what is interesting, why it is difficult for me to answer to your question, because sensory feedback or feed-forward, some researchers think that sensory information is used for the next step. It's a kind of feed-forward. But anyway, let's focus on this specific paper, which I really like. they also show that there is differential effect of sensory information on different gait parameters, such as stride length, stride duration, walking speed, and EMG patterns. So it's not that sensory information affects only synergies, but it affects also general gait parameters, which in turn affect motor patterns. Anyway, I strongly suggest you to look at this paper, and also there is some review of literature about previous studies on the effect of sensory feedback in modeling studies. Concerning your question about what would be my advice about how to study it, it's a really important question. And myself, I did some. I'm more, how to say, I have more experience in the experimental work. Still, I have some collaborations with a Japanese group, and for example, I'll show you this study recent 2 years ago. We use the synergy hypothesis and the model to actually to describe both walking and running pattern. So my advice would be one advice to explore your model, whatever, for different working conditions, because if you fit one condition, then there are many questions about generalization of this sensory feedback. Why? And just now I finish my answer to your question. Because your question is also related to synergies. And synergies, it's also in Mark calls them muscle modes, whatever. One of my questions or problems with synergies, which is actually an open question, it's the task dependence. So they are not actually, you cannot use the same synergies for different working conditions. And again, there is a question, sensory information is used in the same way or not. So one way to generalize and to see and to separate feed-forward and the feedback, it's just to explore in one study many conditions. For example, we tried 7 years ago, again, you can see it on the screen. You can look at our paper this 7 years ago. We tried to characterize synergies for different work conditions, walking backward, forward, to left, right, inclined surface. And what we showed that it's really they're highly task dependent. And moreover, it depends on the muscles. If in your model you include, for example, 8 muscles, so-called major muscles, but each limb contains more than 50 muscles, and more muscles we include, more synergies we have. And they're slightly different. So it's not a simple question. So when you mention that its model can accurately predict working pattern, it's not so accurate, and it is task dependent. So, Benjamin, maybe you can comment.
No, that's very helpful information. I think most of what I've seen in the literature so far in terms of modeling studies has been what I would call simplified models. They're models that tend to be planar. They replicate the structure of the human body, but the parameters, the muscle tendon lengths and moment arms and wrapping surfaces and all of that doesn't tend to be very realistic, but there are some very nice neural control models out there that do have feed forward and feedback control. What I'm thinking about is when Mindy Levin's very nice talk with stroke, for example, what if we had a model where we could replicate some of that threshold information about when spasticity occurs, because we can properly split out feedback and feedback components, not in what I'll call toy models that are very helpful for understanding concepts, but in models that actually represent real human subjects where the model does match their EMG data and their motion data and their ground reaction data, and where the model can potentially even predict some new walking scenarios for which you have experimental data, but you hold it back. So you use it just for prediction purposes. So if we have models that can predict how people are going to function in new circumstances, then those are models that we can probably use to hopefully design treatments at some point. So that's the direction I really want to go in. And I see being able to model as we make the model more realistic and personalized in neural control, we get better predictions of walking.
I wonder if
Guys, please turn off your microphones if you're not speaking. Luis, I think your microphone is on, and you have to. Luis.
Yeah, Yuri, I wonder if and Benjamin, if you would mind, if I would comment on that as well. So we're studying something very related to Rashid Ramadan, who was present in some other sessions but isn't on right now. It seems is working with Hendrik Reimann on a model of locomotion that is actually trying to develop the Hartmut-Gaia model further and make it more neurally realistic. So the Russo paper that was just shown is essentially an exploration of that model. And just to clarify, I would say that class of models doesn't actually really use synergy ideas so far. Parameters to specific degrees of freedom, like the foot elevation is controlled that way and certain joint angles. And the feet flexes, so the compensatory correlations between the degrees of freedom. These reflexes in this model are actually sort of freely invented. Some of them are known reflexes, others are arranged for locomotion to work. We're actually currently working on getting rid of those and trying to make it more aligned with what we can have physiological evidence for. I would say the general theme, though, is the theme that we have in the uncontrolled manifold discussion. And I just want to make that connection because maybe not all of you see that. Because the feed-forward concept of synergy, right? We have low-dimensional parameters that might be related to your goals, like posture in space or still, like controlling the body in space, are sent to all the degrees of freedom. But the kind of compensatory structure that we've seen, that actually amounts to recurrency, which one could think of as feedback, right? This means a question at which level. Is it a sensed signal, or is it the neural signals that drive the muscles that are also exchanged and coupled to each other? And this way, how reflexes introduce recurrency is one possible solution. And Mark's proposal to use sort of Renshaw cell kind of populations would be a possible mechanism for that. So we don't know exactly at which level that happens. But I would say that is sort of the kind of constraints that we know that are required to explain the UCM type of structure is linked, in other words, to feedback and reflexes and recurrency and so on in this picture. And I think we all sort of converge on us needing both. There has to be this descending distribution, but there are recurrent loops in there. So in that sense, I think it's a unifying theme across many different systems.
Yeah. No, I like this question, and I think it is really a good direction to study, Benjamin. I am a bit familiar with your works also, and since I know too many things about synergies, I'm also a bit critical what I want to say, because I know that there are also weak points of this approach, because from my point of view, this task dependence of synergies really it's a problem. Not a problem, but it's a good question, because you cannot explain this for synergies all conditions. And if so, my feeling that synergy for me, it's a kind of attractor. And then sensory information just shapes it so that synergies for me are not rigid. This is my point. Also, there is a question what Gregor mentioned that I don't know actually where they are encoded in the spinal cord or supraspinally. It's also an open question, and it is related to this. Anyway, even if you wish,
add something. So definitely, I think the paper should be read, and Unfortunately, I didn't read the paper and discussed. But for now, I just would like to remind that in 2003 was a model by Günther and Ruder. I use a Lambda model to simulate human locomotion. A lot of muscles, very detailed biomechanics, putting muscles for each leg, and of course, reflexes are organically aware. They use just switch between two reference body configuration to simulate walking, and they demonstrated that the model can work not only in gravity, but on the moon and even in Jupiter. So I think two simulation should be studied in comparison and to see how we can enrich. It's not our model, so I think that it would be helpful to consider both models. Okay, and you call say change parameters, but for me parameters it's some specific, and it would be nice to know what parameters they change in the model to adapt to some to different conditions. Okay, that's just my comment.
Okay, Jose, would you like to ask your question?
Can I actually comment also on the slide? A small comment about this.
In any order, okay, Lana. Why don't you comment
about
and
this
then Jose will
question
ask his question.
Oh, sorry. It was also a question about. Sorry, go ahead, Jose. Is also okay. Sorry, Jose.
Go ahead, Alana. No, since you started, go ahead.
Sorry, I thought you're moving to the next question of the. Okay, so actually relating. First of all, Yuri, thank you for the paper that you shared. It goes directly to the top of my reading list because we're actually really interested in designing a sensory substitution feedback for walking. So it's really directly, I think, will be useful. And with this thinking about sensory substitution and augmentation for walking or for any other kind of scenarios where users are deprived from sensory information, either because they don't receive haptic feedback in surgery or because they're missing tactile information or somatosensory information because of stroke or other neurological disorder. I wonder, when we design these assistive feedback devices, do we really need to try to mimic the sensory feedback, or any kind of information that is at least even vaguely correlated with the kind of signal that was supposed to arrive to the system maybe would be sufficient and the system would learn how to use it? I wonder, what is your thought on that?
Well, I can answer only in the context of locomotion. Actually, neuromodulation now becomes a very hot topic and very important topic for spinal cord injuries. So and one of the ways to change the state of the spinal circuitry, I mean, for locomotion, is just to stimulate sensory information. I'm sure that you're familiar with papers of Edgerton, Gregor Curtin. They use basically both tonic stimulation, sensory, dorsal roots, for example, stimulating, or phasic, in phase with the gait cycle, or differential lumbar sacral segments, which are active during this specific phase of locomotion. So it's a kind of, basically, they try to mimic this stimulation to natural, but at least in gross, how to say, and it works. So it's really very impressive that this phasic modulation of the spinal circuitry, and then animals or even spinal cord injury patients with epidural stimulation, they can produce some stepping. So there are different other ways, I guess, to study it. So I would say it's also interesting to explore this. Benjamin, Actually, again, since you really, for me, you ask a very good question. If you wish, we can even collaborate about this, because I also have questions about, yes, you have a nice model, so that if you wish, we can, because it's difficult to discuss this question within 5-10 minutes.
Oh, I'd love that. I would love that. So I'll contact you offline and we can chat some more.
Yeah.
So, Jose, please.
Yes, Yuri, it's a question regarding your exposure. When it's and also your assumption that the stamp length is remained unvaried despite significant increment in the limb length. I'm a practic and a track and field coach, a sports agent, and I always try to teach that you can increase the stamp length through the vertical mobility of your hips. So I cannot understand why your assumption is like a fact 100% that it's not possible to change. If I, in practice, can do it and teach that I can increase the step length.
Well, I think you refer to my presentation, no? To the condition when step length was not changed when we elongated the shank segment. Is it your question related to this?
Yes, and the results suggest that the existence of the dynamic locomotor body.
Yeah. So it's a good question. I also thought about it before. There are biomechanical constraints. So you cannot, if you change the shank segment, if you elongate it twice, there are some limitations, some constraints for working. You cannot produce very different kinematics. Anyway, my feeling and my answer to your question is the following: that yes, so there is a constraint, and basically about hip. So I don't know how you want to generalize it to your conditions, but my impression that the speed of locomotion and the perception of speed is really related to proximal joints, hip joint, basically. And what we found that both this after surgery and after this mechanical manipulation with stills, subjects perceive really longer steps while they produce short steps. It's a kind of paradox which can be explained only from my point of view. It's again, 5 minutes not sufficient. You can look at this paper, what we published, that we think that there is body scheme, but we think that there is also locomotor body scheme, which uses some simplified information, sensory information to perceive walking speed. And I think that normal subjects, they use basically proximal hip oscillations angle to perceive walking speed. This is actually the message of our paper. And in a sense, you are right that hip is important, but maybe my question was not the direct answer to your, my answer was not the direct response to your question. But basically, shorter step length is because of constraints of biomechanics. If you elongate one segment relative to another segment, you cannot. We have in the supplementary material, we have simulations of if you apply the same angular motion to this new body, then it will be very strange, completely unrealistic left-right coordination. So left hip would go up, while right hip would go downwards. So it's basically you cannot apply the same angular motion to modified body geometry. You need to change angular motion.
Okay, I think we're getting to technical details.
Yes.
And we have to move ahead at least if we want to have a chance to go at least through the first round. So, Toля, Anatol Feldman, I hope you have your questions in front of you and you can address, I think there are 4 questions or so, and you can address them in any order you wish.
Okay. So the first question is, how can I arrive at the EP hypothesis? So it's a more historical question. Yes, if you want, I spent maybe 10 or 15 minutes to share how I arrive at this. Okay, I can take a share screen. I think. Okay. When I was young, like this, okay, let me.
You did not share the screen. Press the green button at the bottom.
No, you just display it on your screen. This. Can you see it?
Yes, of course. Misha can believe, and Toля.
Толя,
Да. Когда when we were young, okay, and I was even younger when. So to start with, we tried with Mark Schick and Alex Klotz, both guys discovered mesencephalic locomotor area with Gregory Arlovsky and Severin, and Alex Scott also like Euro Cellini, but in Moscow he studied H reflexes. And so we try to understand how sensitive muscle spindle afferent to shortening. So when you put on a load on in hand, and when you remove the load, you shorten, muscle shortens, and there is a silent period. I can go to this slide. You see, this is unloading, but we use a very small load.
Toля, we cannot see your slide. You are still stuck on the one with
what happened?
Relate.
I disappeared, Mindy.
Okay, now it's much better.
Okay, you can continue.
But oh,
You just continue. Oh, I see it. Oh, there's a delay. I see. Now I see what you said before. Are you seeing this in real time? Can we hear from Mark or somebody?
Yeah,
we're seeing
we can see the slide that you are showing now. With the unloading reflex. Yes.
There's some delay. They're on a different screen. Just a second. Can you hear us now? No, just relax. No, relax. It's not our computer, it's the internet, okay? You just have to wait. You're unmuted. Mark, can anybody hear us now?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see the slide.
Okay.
But if it is stuck for whatever reason, maybe just stop sharing the screen and Anatol can simply answer the questions without showing all those slides. Otherwise, we will never move beyond the first couple of questions.
I think there was just an internet glitch here, but now we're back on, okay? So if it happens again, I don't think it's a question of the slides, but you can continue.
Okay. So if you see this slide, you see in response to unloading, angle changes, torque changes, and EMG changes. So it established according to EMG force relationship. But we were interested in a silent period. What sense? So we diminish the load, and it appeared that it's very muscle spindle were very sensitive, but it's not the part of the. It's a part of the surgery, but once we unloaded the subject, and for some reason we went outside of the room, living with subject for 20 minutes or so, and when we returned, we saw the subject holding his hand like we left him. And I remember Alex said, "What a stupid guy! He could remove the arm and don't keep the arm. What he is keeping? What is he said?" Asked Alex, and he responded himself, "Oh, perhaps he has a set or tune the system to keep the same position of the arm." So it's what was invariant. Okay, everybody was satisfied with explanation, and we finished the conversation. But after a week, I started to doubt Alex's explanation, because we know that Merton hypothesis was created in 1933, and we know that the hypothesis that implied that muscle spindles can keep the same position of the hand. Okay, so we also knew that Merton hypothesis is incorrect, because in order to keep the position regardless of load, you need to have very high stiffness, and the system, neuromuscular system, doesn't have such a stiffness. So forget about the idea of invariancy of arm position. But nevertheless, the question was, what is invariant in unloading behavior? The question was legitimate, right? And it compels me to think, what is the invariant? So if I look at the EMG, angle, torque, nothing is invariant. It would be easily to explain this change in joint angle if the system could specify EMG level and keep it, like in the differentiated patient, where I have no unloading. So, but EMG changed, angle changed, torque changed. What is invariant was invariant. So I was ready. So actually, alpha version of hypothesis was rejected at this stage of analysis. The system doesn't keep the same level EMG regardless of forces, of load. So by the way, even Nikolai Bernstein thought that the system can specify directly EMG level. He knew that EMG level is velocity, position dependent, so he knew that it's not invariant. So the question is remains, what is the invariant in this simple behavior? So I was ready to give up, and some time when I was traveling in a train, and it came to my mind that maybe when you record characteristic of at certain position, starting at certain position A, its equilibrium point, okay, everything it changes, but maybe some variable related specifically with intentional motion remain invariant when you produce unloading. But if you change the position, you change with invariant. And so this was idea that helped me to continue experiments, asking subject to change intentionally, producing unloading. I got to the same similar characteristic, slightly change in shape, of course. So let's by comparing this characteristic, despite of similar behavior for each of it, I found that what changed from A to B when intentional moment was produced, the position lambda or joint angle at which muscle begin to be activated changes it, and it was eureka. Okay. So that was a story. Okay. I can.
Okay, stop sharing the screen and move to the next questions. Otherwise, we'll get really stuck.
Okay. Okay. The next questions is then I explain anticipatory postural adjustment in terms of equilibrium point hypothesis. I would like to describe experiment the person who asked the question. I have no screen. I don't remember. It's I think it's what is his name? So can somebody?
Sheikh Abdul Khadir asked that question.
Okay, Abdul. So let's. As I remember, anticipatory postural adjustment is observed when the subject is quietly standing, and when he raises the arm comparatively sharply, and muscle activity recorded arm and leg, and it appears that simultaneously or before the arm raised, leg muscle are activated. Okay. Am I correct in description of this anticipated?
Yes, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes. I was asking about the same, yes.
Okay. So, can you explain this behavior in biomechanical term? What do you think? Did you do experiments or you continue with experiments with anticipatory postural adjustment? Because I would like to, somebody gives, say you gives a description in biomechanical terms, and I suggest how the system produces anticipatory postural adjustment in terms of equilibrium point hypothesis. It's a challenging question, I guess.
Well, there are many ways to observe anticipatory postural adjustments. For example, you can be standing and holding a load in front of you, and then you can release that load. And before you release the load, you'll find out that the background activation of your dorsal muscles, which was there to help you maintain vertical position, will disappear. So it will disappear, or it will be suppressed before you release the load. So that would be a typical anticipatory postural adjustment. Of course, it is going to be associated with shifts in mechanical variables, like moments in joints and center of pressure coordinate.
So, but I would like to return to simple demonstration, which I understand that was made initially by Bellingke or somebody. So during quiet standing, when you raise arm comparatively fast, you observe in advance activation of anti-gravitational muscles. Yes, I would like to explain this in a very simple way. When we produce arm motion quicker, we have combination of R and C command. Okay, and as I explained in my talk, there is hierarchy in this combination. I'm sorry. You perform, elevate your arm. Where am I? You elevate your arm by changing rapidly R command, but on the top of it, you produce completely strong activation of agonist-antagonist muscles, and you can feel it, how your arm stiffen at the end and become stiffer with increasing speed. So my explanation is that to do let's mention that anti-gravitational muscles, leg muscles, gastrocnemius soleus, peroneus longus, they are tonically active before onset of movement of the arm. So the system is lazy to isolate just arm muscle to activate biceps, triceps, and so on. It activates all muscles of the body, including leg muscle. So that's the reason why more facilitated muscles, leg muscles, start activating not long, but comparatively early before you finish, you start raising your arm. Okay, that's my explanation, and comparatively simple, I think. And you can also check or modify experiment to see, say, I would predict that when you instead of lifting, you move down, then you will also produce anticipatory postural adjustment. And in modification of Mark's experiment, you can also explain this phenomena into the Lambda model or equilibrium point hypothesis. So that's my answer to the question. The second question, okay. If you want to discuss the...
No, Tolia, we don't have time because we're already nearly 1 hour here and we're only at the second speaker out of 6. There is a good chance that we will not even be able to have 1 round of discussion at this speed.
Okay. Well, I can write the answer. So you can read it, or communicate with me directly by email. I'm ready to answer. Okay.
No, maybe you could answer about contribution of sensory systems to development of referent configuration. How does the sensory system contribute to development of referent configuration? And that's by Vasantan Rajagopalan, if I pronounce it correctly, but I may not be.
Yeah, that's me.
Okay,
thank you.
Good. So, Tolia, why don't you try to answer that question, then we will move ahead to Ilana.
Okay. My question may be related to question to Ilana. And I just want to remind that the 2 things. One is a global factor in control of multiple muscles. That's a difference between actual and referent configuration. And of course, that's one rule. So afferent system with the help of referent control deliver information, sensory information about actual position. So the system always need to receive this information, and it's a whole system practically, propriospinal, vestibular, visual system are involved in this. So the other rule that it's I call it R plus P rule. So in order to know actual position or equilibrium point, you need to count sensory information, not directly, but relative to referent variables you control. And it's explained many things, kinesthetic illusion, phantom limb phenomena, and many other things in kinesthesia and perception. So that's my response. So So at any part of development, you have requirement, specific requirement, not only to motor action, but to sensory system which are involved. For instance, it's not difficult to absorb my child's when they grew up. So the first thing, it's a child learn to stand and even walk. But it took my son approximately 3 months to jump forward, because it requires combination of change in the referent body configuration, shifting referent body configuration in two directions, up and forward. And so, and it takes time to learn. And I think we have paper published quite recently about this. Okay, that's my response to role of sensory information in development.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Tolia, you can now silence your microphone, and Ilana, why don't you take over?
Thank you, and I think it's a beautiful link to the next question. So thank you, Mark, also for seems intentionally making this link. The question is, our assumption, the afferent information does not provide feedback to movements because of time delays in corrective responses. If the above assumption is true, do the sensory inputs alternatively play a role in generating an internal representation of physical characteristics of the limb? And I think it's the continuation of the same question. If there is an internal representation, how does it help to reducing future movement errors? So I guess this question is kind of broad, and I would probably say that quite a few people here would have different answer to this question, so I will give my try. But I guess that's the whole point, in my opinion, to kind of try to understand what is to answer the question, do they play a role in forming some form of computation, an internal, you may call it internal representation, you may call it a scheme for planning the next movement. Do they, is sensory information used for planning future movements? Absolutely, yes. But I think the more interesting question is how the sensory information is like what is this sensory information? What are its components? Is it only error information? Is it forces? Are these tactile afferents? Are these how it's combined with visual information? And then what are the aspects of the external world, not only my limb, but also the external world, if I'm in contact with some object, that are specified? And I think this would be the whole point of discussion, of trying to understand what are exactly the computations that are done and how they're used for different tasks. So I wonder, can you, whoever asked this question, can you specify what exactly did you mean to ask?
Yeah, it was basically how does the first part of the question is there an internal representation
of the world, or of my hand, or
of both the things?
Of body parts, you mean?
Yeah, because I think with one part, I don't think we can be successful in our acts, right?
So I guess that I would say that, well, the question is there internal representation? It's a tough question to answer in general.
It's a very easy question to answer. The answer is, of course, yes, because the word internal representation is undefined, which means that is there a reflection in the body of, for example, having a hand? Of course, there is a reflection of the body from proprioceptors, from tactile receptors, from vision, and from memory, because we
right. And then,
yeah.
so I completely agree with Mark that yes, that there is a computation that takes into account previous information, especially errors. But I would not necessarily, it's a question of how you define error, right? Because it's the error with respect to the target that you were trying to acquire.
Sound.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We lost this.
Oops. Mindy, are you speaking up or no?
I was trying to.
Well, we can hear you with a lot of echo because Anatole was. So if you want to speak up, unmute yourself and speak up, but one at a time. Well, Ilana, why don't you continue, and then Anatole and Mindy will figure out.
Yeah. So I guess that if in the sense of an internal presentation being a use of a previous information for planning the next movement, definitely. What kind of previous information, whether it's errors, whether it's prediction error, whether it's a failure to perform the task, whether it's just sensory information that is in accordance or in contradiction to what you expected it to be, I think the interesting question is to try to come up with ways to computationally formulate how that information is used. And I think that in many cases, especially in the extreme cases of moving in free space or being in contact with rigid objects, or in kind of more vague situations where in contact with elastic objects, like the ones that like some of the studies that I'm interested in. In this case, it's kind of interesting that you can formulate these representations in terms of whether you're interested in controlling the contact force or whether you're interested in controlling your movement in contact with these elastic objects. And then your errors could be also defined as errors in the execution of movement compared to what you expected, or in the tactile information that you are experiencing on the tip of your fingers, or in the force information that you are experiencing in the joints. So in this sense, definitely yes.
Okay, so that was my primary.
I can comment also about delays. There is opinion also in the literature that in static and dynamic conditions, actually sensory information is processed differently. And internal representation and dynamic conditions, just you may look just in the Google, in the PubMed, it's dynamic body scheme, and you may find some literature about this.
Yeah.
And another comment about the delays is actually there is a whole question of whether the delays itself in the sensory information and in the response are in some way represented. And we've studied that. I have a complicated question to that answer. Complicated answer to that question as well, because it kind of depends if the delay is in the visual information or in the force information. And we still haven't got to trying the delay in tactile information, but it's something that I'm really interested in.
Okay, good.
There was a comment about in the chat about maybe the CNS compares rather than the CNS computes would be more accurate for statements about internal representations. I like the comparison idea because especially a lot of the things thinking about adaptation and especially implicit adaptation now I think is beautifully formulated with the ideas of prediction error. So comparing to what you expect would be a really nice way of formulating it, in my opinion. Yes, I like it.
Thank you. Good. Okay, Gregor, I think we are up to your questions. Go ahead.
Okay, so one question is about does movement emerge automatically without the help of planning? So this probably hinges on what is meant by planning. So on the one hand, there is certainly planning in the sense that early parts of the movement are already informative about what kind of movement it is. So, for instance, if you take the first 20 milliseconds, you can of a movement, you can sort of predict the movement time, the movement amplitude, things like that. So there was some regularity to the movement as a whole, and therefore you would have to assume that when the movement is started, the nervous system knows what kind of movement it's going to make. That's certainly not a notion that necessarily implies that there is some fixed thing in the brain, a plan that is being read out, and that's sort of like a tape, and you run it, and therefore this what you I think might be referred to as emergence, that this happens in real time, sort of unfolds in real time, is much more appropriate, and you can see that, for instance, from the fact that you can update a movement, so that you plan a movement to a particular target, the target jumps. This is this Goodale, Parblon, and others have done that. Make a target jump, and you adjust the trajectory on the fly. It takes about 100 milliseconds to do that adjustment, but it is automatic. It can be even done if you're not aware of the jump, because it happens during a saccadic eye movement, for instance, and you still see that updating. So you can see that whatever these movement parameters are that control the movement as a whole, they are continuously linked to sensory input, with that delay. But at any time, you can insert that change any time. And so they are, in that sense, more dynamic objects. And that is, of course, what neural networks do. If you think of the neural networks actually generating these activation patterns that will lead to movements of a particular kind, then those are doing that on the fly. Right? It's not some readout of some tape. There are some old textbooks where there were little tape recorders, like the old book by Bullock had little tape recorders, the motor program, these notions, right? These were metaphors, and really they, as process models, they are not, they shouldn't be taken literally in that way. So I would say there's certainly, in that sense, planning, but it emerges automatically, if you wish. The second question is, if one movement target is preferred, does the neural network automatically inhibit movement towards other areas in the workplace? So there is good evidence for inhibition of alternatives in visual search and orienting and eye movements and so on. Actually, behavioral evidence in the motor domain reaching, not sure I know of any. In my talk, I showed a slide. I can put that slide up again for you to remember. This slide here that has some kind of neural suggestion for that. This is from John Kalaska and Zizek, where they recorded from, in this case, from dorsal premotor cortex, a certain technique of looking at the neural activation over movement direction. This is the population representation that I briefly discussed. And you see here is where the selection takes place, where the monkey knows it's this movement rather than that movement. In terms of movement direction, you see that the population really inhibited here. The blue is below resting level. So that's neural inhibition. Of course, we don't really know if this is exactly the place where the behavioral consequences of inhibition would show up, but that would be consistent with a thought like that. It would be very typical. In our model, certainly we're assuming that the selection itself is based on some form of inhibition. So the answer would be yes, it inhibits automatically.
Thank you. Just a follow-up of that for a bit of clarity.
Yes.
So does this also mean that the degrees of freedom problem is solved in part by the neural networks automatically?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually no other way how it could be solved, right? I mean, that's a different topic. So we certainly think downstream. I mean, there's, in other words, these selections and the planning happen likely in the brain at a level that doesn't yet deal with all the degrees of freedom. That is more about spatial targets and movement parameters and so on. And we know that then these signals are distributed into a much more complex activation vector that goes to all the different muscles. And again, there are interactions in there. And I mean, that neural network, it could be partly spinal, it could be the descending parts, could be multiple contributions like from cerebellum and even basal ganglia. And these are neural networks that, their activity unfolds in time. And in that sense, it's all automatic, right? And some signatures that we have of how the degree of freedom problem is solved are consistent with that. For instance, when you perturb briefly a movement as you're reaching the goal, then we find this motor equivalent pattern that Mark, for instance, has shown in that one study, that you arrive at a slightly different configuration to reach for the target. And that must mean that some sensory signals about that perturbation have updated activation patterns. So now the different muscles go to different equilibrium lengths in the end. And that is happening automatically, right? It's a neural network that runs to an attractor state, one would say. Yuri just used that term. A recurrent network typically has attractor states, and different sensory inputs can shift those states around, and therefore the attractor sort of tracks these changes, right? That's what I would call automatic. I would say actually everything in the brain is like that. So we're working actually in a different line of work on how higher cognition, things that look very information processing, how even language, how you make sequences of thought, they're actually also of the same nature. When I'm talking like that now, it's automatic, right? In my brain, activation patterns, one triggers the next, and then I make selection decisions every moment in time. What's the next word I'll pronounce? So in that sense, that's a very general property.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I would like to add that I totally agree with Gregor that the word planning, say, movement, maybe it's outdated. So movement emerges according to referent control. And that's important shift in I would like to say in paradigm. It's so we need to take it and to approach to analysis of brain and motion from this point of view. An example Gregory gave and other groups gave to illustrate this very important point. So I would like to add that we also should question the idea of internal models in computational strategy. I think we also should agree that this language converted to some kind of jargon which satisfied proponent of this jargon, but doesn't help in advancing understanding how movement is control and perception is produced.
All right, Anatol, thank you. Gregor, thank you. Gregor, do you have anything else to say?
So it's just like Kevin, those people who do computational motor control, they are not claiming that that movement doesn't emerge. I mean, they also think neural networks work like that. They just think it's useful to describe abstractly some function that describes the performance of these networks. Whether that's useful or not is a real debate. I also think it tends to distort scientific. It's essentially a question of heuristics. What kind of questions you ask might not always be the best questions. But I don't think that they differ fundamentally on this insight that in the neural networks activation patterns emerge and movement emerges like that. So them saying it computes is just a metaphor, a description, an abstract description. Whether that's useful or not is the other question.
Well, Gregor, some of them think about it quite in a direct way, not as a metaphor, but as an actual computational device that computes something. So we shouldn't put them all together. We shouldn't put all computational neural control people together into a single bucket. But yes, I agree that among people who use the terminology of computation and internal models, there are people who understand very well that these are metaphors rather than direct meanings. Okay.
Mark, can I just comment, very general comment, very brief, about inhibition, a bit of neurophysiology. Just I would like to mention that most synapses in the spinal cord are inhibitory. So in a sense that inhibition is much more important than activation. And why? Because the same interneuron and motor neuron participates in a huge repertoire of movements, so that in order to perform movements, you need to inhibit all other movements. So inhibition is, from my point of view, is much more important than activation. Just a comment.
Yeah. This question in the chat, was that by Roger, was that meant to be follow-up of this, or is it a separate question?
Okay, so shall we? No, it's a separate question that Roger just asked. So I'm the next one, I assume, unless, Gregor, you want to say something else? Okay, I had a couple of questions, and I will try to create a single answer, kind of to glue them together. One is from Sheikh Abdul Qadir. Is there a paradigm shift in the understanding of atypical movements in neurological patients, and why should we bother much about variation in the motor behavior? And from Basantanda Chakopalan, who asked a lot of questions, and it's very nice, of course. Is there any variable that's stabilized by brain during learning a task when we practice? So I'm going to share my screen, and then, because I prepared a couple of slides. All right. So first of all, let's begin with neurological patients. And I'm going to schematically say that there may be many reasons for neurological pathology in terms of motor control. Like, for example, a person may not be able to produce, for various reasons, the appropriate patterns of the referent coordinate at the task level. So maybe it's a vision problem, maybe it's neglect, maybe it is spasticity that doesn't allow entering certain zones, spatial zones, but at a task level. The second one, the mapping of that referent coordinate for the task level to referent coordinate at lower levels. Like, for example, one joint may be missing after amputation, or it may be painful to move, or there may be local spasticities affecting some muscle groups, but not other muscle groups. So, which is reflected in atypical involvement of elements. And then the third one is what we've been studying a lot, is stability properties, which have been kind of overlooked before, because unstable or dynamically unstable movement patterns are useless. They're dysfunctional by definition, because we can never predict all the forces of interaction with the environment and all the changes in the intrinsic body states that are going to happen in future. So whatever, even with the most powerful neural networks assumed in the brain. So movements have to be dynamically stable. And sometimes the problems at that level are reflected in low stability at steady states and impaired controlled loss of stability in preparation to action. These are the phenomena of anticipatory synergy adjustments. When people in preparation to a quick action, they destabilize the variable that they plan to change quickly in future. So variability by itself, I don't think it's a big issue. I think structure of variance as a reflection of stability is a big issue. Now, being too variable, it usually means being not stable enough with respect to the target. If the person is trying, understands, we assume that the person understands the task and is trying to perform it as well as possible. So, effects of practice or effects of rehabilitation, because we can consider practice in patients as well. Well, we have these three problems. Let's see how these three problems can be resolved. First, finding adequate, either optimal with respect to some criteria or good enough, not violating some criteria by too much, control trajectory at the task level. That may be non-trivial if you cannot do it, well, you simply cannot do the task. But you may be able to do it even with the restrictions associated with an impairment in the system, but differently. So normally if I do the finger pointing to my nose, I'll do it like that. But if, for example, some of my joint rotations are strongly punished or impossible, I may do it like that. And there is nothing wrong with this solution as long as I saw, okay, it's awkward and strange, but there is nothing wrong with it if it's the only solution available to the system. But I have to find it. I have to find a control trajectory in terms of the referent coordinate at the task level to perform the task. Finding mapping to lower level referent coordinates. Again, the endpoint trajectory typically may be implemented by an infinite number of lower level or element level trajectories, which correspond to element level referent coordinates as functions in time. Again, can be optimal or good enough. And then ensuring adequate stability of action. Now we get to the second question about practice. So the idea is that if you want practice to be effective with respect to some behavior, you should challenge that aspect of behavior specifically. So one thing that I want to mention is this trade-off between optimality and stabilities, which is sometimes ignored. So if this is because I have a two-dimensional screen, I'm using the same example all the time. So imagine that you have two elements that press in parallel to produce total force of some magnitude. And this UCM, this blue line, corresponds to the solution space when the sum of the two elements is a constant. This green ellipse illustrates a possible distribution of data points when the variance along the uncontrolled manifold is bigger than orthogonal to it, which we associate with a synergy stabilizing that variable. But let's now take a look at the central point where the subject is most likely to be. We can say that, okay, the subjects are never using the whole uncontrolled manifold. From the point of view of the task, all these points are equivalent. However, some are preferred and some are strongly dispreferred. So we can introduce or invoke the notion of optimality, that a point is preferred that corresponds to a minimum of some cost. All right, so imagine that this is the central red point. Note that other points along the UCM violate this criterion. So if you have large variance along the uncontrolled manifold, this means that you have high stability for a given variance orthogonal. Let's assume that it never changes. Then increase in stability, but decrease potential and optimality, because any deviation from this optimal point that correspond to the increase in variance, they're suboptimal by definition. They violate the optimality criteria. So what should the person try to achieve? Well, it depends on the task and it depends on the state of the person. Higher stability, if stability is an issue or is the problem, like, I don't know, falls in elderly, the first thing that comes to mind, like, for example, then probably optimality is not that important because, all right, so you'll spend more energy, but you won't fall down and you won't break the leg. If somehow you are dealing with a marathon runner who is training to be the best, then probably energy expenditure may be very, very crucial, while stability may not be such a big issue because it's a standard task performed in standard conditions. Perturbations are going to be within a relatively small range, so one may be able to trade the other way around. So, basic rule to improve a feature, challenge it. And let's assume that now you practice to do a task and you try to improve accuracy in your performance. So your bad variance, or orthogonal to the uncontrolled manifold variance, is expected to drop. No way, because if it didn't, this means you didn't learn, you didn't improve your performance, so you wasted your practice. However, variance along the uncontrolled manifold can change in any way, because by definition, it doesn't affect performance. So if before practice you had this type of distribution of data points, this fat ellipse, so some degree of stability, but not a lot, and a lot of error corresponding to this large orthogonal variance, these are the three scenarios. In all of them, orthogonal variance dropped by the same amount, but variance along uncontrolled manifold can drop proportionally, can be unchanged, or can drop disproportionately more than orthogonal variance. Actually, all of those have been described for different tasks and different stages. So if the task is very new, then the most likely scenario is this bottom one, or maybe even that one. If the task is over-practiced, and people are so confident in its performance that they don't consider stability a challenge anymore, and they start to become more optimal. That's the picture that's shown on the top. So one of the issues that we tried to explore, I'll take maybe 2 more minutes, is can you decrease orthogonal variance and increase variance along the uncontrolled manifold? Because in a lot of cases that we saw in different types of patients, the problem is not in the orthogonal variance. It's not the problem of accuracy. The problem is in stereotypy, which is another word for poor stability. So if there is a perturbation, if something happens, then you will have equal chances to be disturbed in any direction if you don't have this structure of stability, and that will violate the task potentially. So can you increase the uncontrolled manifold variance? We actually ran a series of studies when we invented a task which encouraged, we challenged stability. So the task was pressing with fingers and going inside a tube. Center point is shown and the error margins. And the subjects got the feedback as time outside the tube and root mean square with respect to the central line. And the task was always different. It was glued from half sine waves with a certain distribution. But then we cheated. We showed the subjects not their force without telling them. But we showed them this equation on the bottom that you can probably hardly see. It's basically, it corresponds to moving not along a flat line, but along a ridge of the mountain with steep slopes. And we changed the steepness of the slopes. As soon as they started to create errors, these errors became larger and larger with deviations. So they really were challenged in terms of stability of this performance without explicitly showing on the screen. They were never told what happened. And we increased this coefficient of instability that we modified with the improvement in their performance. So they became better, they were given a more unstable task. They became better, more unstable task. So this is kind of a non-scientific illustration. That's what you're supposed to do. And you're moving over the ridge, and there are slopes. And these slopes can be steep. And this is what happens, that with practice, uncontrolled manifold variance increased. And variance, and this is solid lines only, disregard the dashed line. And the orthogonal variance decreased. So they became more accurate, and it was retained after 2 weeks. And they became more variable at the level of elements, but all that variability went into the uncontrolled manifold. Okay? So total variance increases, and then, by the way, during retention, it was even higher. So one can design tasks, practice, that challenges certain aspects of performance that you think are the issue and that you want to improve in your subject. And you can actually produce performance with rather unusual outcome when the elements become much more variable, while the performance task is more accurate, is less variable than before. Unfortunately, we haven't developed it well enough to the clinical population, partly due to COVID and partly due to the fact that we got sidetracked for other studies. Okay, so I'll stop sharing, and these are two of my answers. So if there are follow-up questions to those answers, please ask them. And if not, I'll say something quickly in response to Roger's question. So far, so good? Okay, then Roger asked an interesting question related to Bernstein's levels. It is said that levels of control are nested into each other, they're nested into E, etc. But the way these levels are constructed seems to show that they're embedded from the bottom, B embedded into A, etc. Thoughts? Well, I think that if you just take Bernstein's scheme at its face value, it is created by an evolutionary biologist. So the levels follow the evolutionary sophistication of the system. Level A is present in a lot of animals that can hardly do much more than crawl. And level B already becomes synergic. So you unite muscles into groups for certain purposes. So it's grouping of muscles and ensuring dynamical stability. And level C, you already start to act in the environment, whether it's a peripersonal environment or really large environment. And level D, it starts to make sense. You're not just act in the environment, but you act in the environment for purpose. And level E, it's very high level sense. Like you're writing a message, you're not just writing garbage, but you're writing a specific message. So in a way, evolutionary, they are built bottom up, in my opinion. However, when you perform an action, it goes in the opposite direction of the pyramid. You start with a message you want to convey, you start to handwrite this message to the person you want to. In order to do that, you have to organize a piece of paper and a pen, and you should have a particular organization of all the muscles. You should have a particular posture so that you don't collapse under gravity and so forth. So I would say that it depends. If you consider the evolutionary evolvement of the levels, it is bottom up. If you consider how the actual movements are produced, it's top down. Okay, so I think I will now hand it over to Mindy. Mindy, are you there? Unmute yourself, please. Okay, good. So, Mindy, take over your questions. Are you ready?
I'm ready, but there's a big echo. Do you hear the echo?
Yes, we have the echo too.
All right, I'm going to mute.
You might need headphones.
How about this? Is it better?
Maybe it's two computers in one room connected to the same system.
The sound. But now I'm on Anatol's computer, so you should be hearing me well.
Yeah.
Okay. So my question's on my computer. So it had to do with, can we use, I think one of the questions was, can we use Tsrt to measure the effectiveness of a therapy? And that's a very good question. And of course, that would be something we want to see, whether in fact, when we do therapy, do we actually change the level of, if you want, excitability of the system, and can we generate a greater level of control? This is a very important question, and I don't, other studies might look at whether they use the term motor control in a little bit wider context, maybe a little bit imprecise context, where people think that if somebody can make a movement of a larger amplitude, they have better motor control. It's true that they have better motor behavior. They can increase the range of motion. They can move through that range of motion with better control over the smoothness of the movement and so forth. But unless we see what's happening inside the system in terms of control, we don't really know whether control has changed. We can just say behavior has changed. And that behavior could be changed because the muscle has become stronger through a hypertrophy of muscle fibers and so forth. There may be a lot of peripheral factors that lead to a person being able to change their motor output. But in terms of control, I think the only way we can see if there's actually been a change in control is looking at the Tsrt, which is our proxy of the ability of the system to modulate lambda. So we have, we're actually asking that question right now. We have done a responsiveness study, which means we did a study where we had measured TSRTs in patients prior to an intervention, then we did an intervention and then measured after the intervention, so pre-post study, and we looked at how much other variables, other clinical measures changed, like whether they got more, whether they reduced their level of impairment according to another scale that's validated, and then compared that to the change in the TSRT. And there were changes in TSRT, but what we found was that that wasn't across the board. And so we're trying to figure out now, like it wasn't all the patients. We had a total of about 50 patients. There are 56 patients, and some people improved TSRT and other indicators of motor function, like the Fugel-Meyer scale, and other patients didn't, or they only improved one or the other. So we're in the process of seeing what is the relationship. So the major question is, do you expect a change in a single muscle activation level? So TSRT is measured in a single muscle. So does the change in the TSRT in biceps affect the ability to reach the whole arm? Probably not, right? So that's why the mapping of a change in the TSRT may not be directly equivalent to the change in the function. So we may have to look at other ways of addressing that question. Did that, but we do expect that to happen. And now we have a tool for actually measuring a change in a control variable, which is, I think, the very first time we have, aside from a direct look at what the nervous system is doing at the alpha motor neuron level, which is a very nice tool for change. I think there was another question, I think it was from Vasantan, about the difference between rigidity and spasticity. Was that your question, Vasantan?
Yes, ma'am. That was my question.
But I really didn't understand what you're getting at, so maybe you can reformulate that question?
Yeah. We are capable of now explaining about the TSRT and what's the origin of the spasticity. All right. So in the same model, EP model, how do we explain rigidity?
I think I showed a slide where we showed that the TSRT velocity sensitivity was different in different types of hypertonic disorders. So we showed that for spasticity, there was a clear velocity dependence of the dynamic stress. So you stretch at different speeds and you get a slope, which was interpreted.
The line was vertical in terms of rigidity, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's vertical in terms of rigidity. So that means that there's no velocity sensitivity, but there's still a critical joint angle, which is usually called the catch angle, or what we find when we do a cogwheel kind of response. So that when there's that catch angle is probably synonymous with the TSRT.
Yeah, so we can utilize the same method in order to see an improvement even in the rigidity patients, if I'm not wrong, right, ma'am?
Yeah, well, what you would like to see, though, in people with rigidity is for the TSRT to be located further along the muscle length when the muscle is longer, but also that some kind of velocity sensitivity is returned. The velocity insensitivity is the abnormality.
Okay, so...
Okay. All right.
So you mean that if the velocity sensitivity increases, it's a sign of improvement, right?
I would think so. I think another question we have is in children, for example, there's a kind of mixed syndrome called dystonia or dystonic spasticity. And we have a study with Citlali, if you remember, Citlali Lopez Ortiz, which is in process, and we're trying to determine whether children, whether this technique of measuring TSRT can identify which patients have a spastic type of dystonia and which have a rigid type of dystonia. It's usually a mixed thing. And this is a problem with treatment of dystonia. Do you treat the muscle as if it's spastic or do you treat it as if it's rigid? And it does affect medications and other kinds of treatments in children. So there's a lot of interest in being able to identify spasticity versus other hypertonic muscle disorders based on, TSRT seems to be a very promising way of doing that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And that was the end of my question, unless there's somebody else with something that they want to say to us in the whole group. You're talking about affordances, I see, with Mark. So I'm going to hang up.
Yeah, we're just chatting about it. No, there are a few questions for everybody. One of them is related to the discussion of that Roger now is having and started with the Bernstein's level. And the question, what could effects of stroke be at different Bernstein's level, A, B, C, D, E? Well, we should qualify this question because effects of stroke are in the brain. I mean, secondary consequences can be at other levels.
Actually, effects of stroke are everywhere because there's, like I said, that they're happening at the cortical level, subcortical level. It can happen also at the muscle.
Well, but not in the muscle.
There's changes in muscle fiber properties.
Yes, secondary. Yeah. But that's a slightly different issue, right? But strokes don't happen in the muscle or in the spinal cord, for example. Secondary changes are everywhere, of course. So, Mindy, do you want to respond to the question, to relate, to say anything else?
I think it's an interesting question because,
actually, Bernstein in his book described in a lot of detail effects of stroke on movements in patients as illustrations of his levels.
Yeah, at every level, but top down more than bottom up.
Yes, top down. So he's more interested in direct effects of stroke. His famous example that was also described once by Mihamirsky is if you ask a person with a particular stroke to raise the arm as high as possible, and this person can raise it to a particular level and says, no, I cannot do it higher than that. And then you take a hat, give this person the hat and say, put it on that hook. and the arm with the head suddenly goes all the way up. Bernstein has this example that giving the head translates the movement organization to a different level, to a high.
Mark, you're muted.
I muted myself, sorry about that. All right, we have a few more general questions. Anatol, if Lambda is controlled by the brain, then is it learned during practice, development, or a result of ontogeny? Are Lambda shifts planned?
I don't understand the question.
That's how it's formulated. So basically, do we learn Lambda as functions of time when we practice movements, or we are born with some knowledge of how to shift Lambdas?
My general was a question to me, how we learn in general. My response is general too. So we describe in due time, and Mini illustrated it in one trial learning paradigm. But what we use so-called recurrent strategy. We during learning we memorize, reproduce, and modify depending on result control variable or reference. It's working for explanation of many motion. Lambda. So if you take a minimization principle, so the system try to diminish difference between muscle length and lambda, or say between actual and reference configuration, and you should understand this principle not as you specify R command and C each time. No, the system involved changes at many levels, including R command at level lambda and so on. So, but I can repeat. So these changes are emergent, and general principles say that it's the system first of all try to maintain the motor action requirement. Okay, so that's how the system works. Nothing is constant. Everything varies, and so. But on the example, what? I think it's in process of development. You can, unless the reflex arc, stretch reflex arc appeared, no, there is no lambda. So it's experimental question. I don't know. For instance, we have data that if you cut proprioception, whereas after some time there is a reinnervation of muscles and receptors, but there is no stretch reflex. So in this case, the system conditionality of muscle activation still not working. So it's a question I would like to have some data allow us to respond to this question. Okay, Minnie said that after stroke patient stroke or supposedly even in rigidity, there is an ability of the system to expand lambda control or so facilitate relaxation of muscle, reducing spasticity or rigidity. Okay, so that's basically I respond that we need experimental data in order to respond.
Okay, thank you. You know what I wanted to ask the question by Xiaofeng Sheng. Which types of questions in neuroscience can be explored by using robots as surrogates, as subjects? What are advantages and disadvantages of these methods compared to invasive animal experiments? So can we replace animals in our experiments by specifically created robots? I think this is a very interesting question, and I wonder who wants to take a shot.
I'll be happy to say something about that. So we sometimes actually use robots as tools in a sense. But of course, robots are things you design, right? You have to, particularly you program their control or their movement planning and so on. And so I think a useful way of how robots can be used is actually as heuristic tools. So you develop models, for instance, how the nervous system might control movement. And then by bringing it on a robot, you have a tool that helps to discover errors of thinking, that helps to discover processes that might be missing, problems that you have, whether your approach is actually really generative, can actually do the task. Sometimes you discover difficulties and so on. So proof of concept and heuristic tool, I don't think that the robot per se will help you discover anything in your model that you didn't put in, right? It's just not, you can't just take the robot as a given and then you study it because you design it, right? So in that sense, I would say it's a tool, especially for theoretical work, understanding theories well, but it cannot replace invasive experiments when those are aimed at really finding out the neural mechanisms that you would model.
I can add to this. Two tendencies in robotics I noticed. One is traditional, when you based on law of mechanics and introducing neural networks, but there is a I would say closer to biological, to imitate biological motor control in Italian group, robotic group BICI, or not BICI, but BICI. They imitate muscle control based on equilibrium point hypothesis, using R and C command and so on. And it helps, for instance, imitate a lot of aspects of grasping. And actually, one of them presented, one of from this group presented at our school. Yes, Mark, I think Bike Antonio. So I think we need to remember that for understanding of motor control, robotic is some kind of models, but models, there is expression that all models are wrong some of them are useful. Okay, so that's we should have in mind.
All right, good.
Also, one comment.
Go ahead.
Also, one comment just I have, because I participated in several projects, robotics, about walking, basically, both humanoid robots and exoskeletons, because this depends also what we are talking about, humanoid robots. Robots, basically, the problem is actually, for example, muscle series, whatever, they have different factors. So they have motors which are very different from human muscles. And if motors are different, they should be controlled differently. This is a big problem for motor control. And I talk to many people, so that basically the control of humanoid robots is very different from actually human. They use mathematical equations, basically, which are not implemented in the brain. This is a problem actually, that they have different muscles. So if you want to mimic biological system, we also need to use some biological muscles for robots.
Yeah. That's right. Well, variable stiffness systems, as Gregor mentioned, and also under-actuated systems and is another way of trying to make it look more human-like and maybe improve stability of the action. You know what? We don't have much time left, so I want to introduce a very interesting question from Daniel Teodoro, who described in detail his experiments with the deer-fronted monkeys. And the deer-fronted monkeys at some point would use their, if only one arm is deer-fronted, and please, Danielle, correct me if I'm wrong, they would use their intact arm to grab food and to manipulate things. However, if you put the intact arm into, for example, a plastic ball, so it cannot grasp anything. They have to use their deer-fronted hand, and they do. But when they use their deer-fronted hand, they mirror as if leading it by the normal hand, by the intact hand. So we have a sequence of, and there are other observations, we have a sequence of questions, how one can interpret the crossover effect. So you deal with vision control movement of a deer-fronted hand, which is somehow helped by the intact hand to do a targeted movement. Now, how can you interpret the role of crossover, efference or re-efference from the intact hand that try to mirror movements, or, mirror movements made by the deer-fronted hand? At which level could these crossover effects happen? And do they actually play a role? Or is this a desperation strategy? I don't know, that's my part. How similar might be the use of these mechanisms post-unilateral stroke recovery?
Can you clarify these mirroring movements? Are they timed? Do they have a characteristic time profile, or are they more sort of like servoing?
Daniel, this question is definitely for you.
When they're pulling against a spring in a limb flexion, they make one pull, and once they've reached the level required to avoid a shock after a click, they repeat it very characteristically. As you increase the requirement, they adjust to the new requirement and reproduce it very well, in contrast to intact monkeys that keep pulling and go way beyond the effort required to avoid the shock. So the question for me was, are they following a strict, adequate program as might have been suggested, or are they the normal animals suffering an interference on a program from the sensory input? No, there's noise to signal.
In a sense, I would say the normal animal solves a more complex task because it also has to retune the reflexes as it does that to stabilize the new posture. And maybe that is an interference. And the efferented animal, in a way, has the simpler task of just making the right forward command.
Right.
And as long as that system is intact, it could perhaps adjust that command to some template or some servo-like mechanism. That may be a possible reading.
So the question I was asking, if both four limbs are deafferented, you see a greater recovery. If one limb is deafferented, the animal is only leading with the intact limb. And Taub had proposed this notion of learned helplessness. So it keeps changing that. But it seems to me like there's really the crossover effects between the two sides of the brain and of the within the spinal cord that are critical. And I just wonder if any of you have any thinking about that. From experiments with
and again, one could think, if the two limbs are actually solving slightly different tasks, because one of them is really also retuning the reflexes, then maybe that could interfere more than if they're both one component. Yeah, but I don't know.
Once they're using both limbs, very well intercoordinated, and you would have to see the videos to see how well intercoordinated they are.
All right.
It seems the plasticity factor is...
Anatole, if you want something to say the final words of wisdom, and then we'll stop it because we've been talking for quite some time.
I just wanted to ask, is it a correction of or using a healthy arm right away, or it takes time to relearn the system, and maybe some plasticity is involved. So it would be nice to know. Can you suggest?
Well, it's for example, if you do the dorsal column lesion, there is a loss of independent digital movement. If you diaphragm, the digital movements return, which was a very striking phenomenon that we saw in having to pick with 2 fingers a food pellet from a holder. So my question was about this cross-spinal inhibition that Taub and others had proposed, and I believe it was your Mindy who invoked it in her talk.
Okay, I think at this positive note, we should thank all the participants, all the speakers, and of course Luis Machizuki, who helped us a lot in making this possible, and also in making sure that people can watch it on YouTube if they cannot join the sessions. So I'm going to thank everybody very much. It's been fun to see you all and to communicate with you all. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mark.
See you next year. Well, maybe personally, I hope personally.
Yes, yes.
Bye-bye. See you.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oi, Rosinha. Tudo bem?
Sim, sim. Tudo bem. Até, Heraldo, até esse atrasinho de 2 minutos me ajudou, porque eu estava coordenando uma palestra agora e a palestra acabou agora. Então, e na verdade eu tava com 2 fones de ouvido, né? Então agora eu já tirei. Ah. Ah, ela tá aqui. Eu tô aqui na Yash também. Vou sim, vou sim. Uhum. 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 Eu não. Rosinha, eu também, assim, não. Eu também não vou poder ficar muito tempo, porque 4 horas, 4h15 eu dou aula, já começo a dar aula de novo. Mas mas eu não vou ficar em primeiro, porque como eu não estava na outra reunião, né? Deixa vocês em primeiro. Faz primeiro da Linda, faz primeiro da Linda. Não, faz o seu, porque dá. Puxa. Vai sim, vai sim. Sim.